that you think you need to be thinking about?
I think the story could get a little long if I focused maybe I focused too much on setting up why we were in Chicago. Yeah, everybody's not in their head with, maybe.
Now, you don't have to agree with them,
okay,
actually. You or me, and this is very important. I have a phrase that I use when I give something to consider. I'll say, or not. And it's a very important piece because that says your choice. So you could change this part, or you could think about this or not. Okay, go ahead.
Well, I think the only reason I tell the part about my dad and being down there with the brain surgeries because maybe they would be a little more sympathetic to my mom and her emotional state and how traumatic this event actually was.
Okay.
But I can see that it's probably even, like you had mentioned, could even be confusing the audience too.
Okay. So one of the things she and I chatted about, and sometimes this happens, in paper we take a long time to set up a story, and the fact that you're on paper means that the reader gets bored with how you're setting it up, they just skip to where the story is. You know James Michener? Reading through how the islands were formed and how the volcano things, and let's get to the part of Hawaii where there are people. So you're 25% through, but you get to that part is a natural part for a lot of us. And so, again, reflecting on it, one of the things you want to watch for is you don't want about half of the story to be why they're in the hotel and then half of the story there. It's so evenly balanced that that's the confusing part. So you're going to want to think about, is the story about why you're there, and then what happened there is less. So you want to give spatial clues on where the story is. Half and half is confusing, so give more space to why you're there and let this other part be, a wrap up to it, or jump in sooner, but the equalness is not working. So you kind of think about which angle you want to put your lens on in terms of where the story is. In my cow story, I start off with, I grew up on a farm, I'm the oldest of 9, I live with my grandpa and grandma, boring. So I just jumped right in. My dad said I couldn't have a horse. And actually, I wanted to tell you all that stuff. That is very important to me for you to know my little life on my farm, but it's not important to telling the story. How I would know this for sure is to be asking the lesson learned. So let's explore that just a little bit since you're still shaping it, and that might give you some way of deciding what stays in and how much and what that looks like. You tell this story with such flair, and I have to tell you, I really enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to it being part of a voiceover. Noticing how often you are telling them the good stuff. Jan is so good at that. She says, oh, I'm glad you're here and you're so important. She actually means that, but it is a kind of resourcefulness that you give them in honoring what you did enjoy and without judging any of it. Just be sure you start in those places. And I really mean that. I would just love to see this as a digital. We all would. What I'm wondering, though, is as you tell that story, and I think you've told it a number of times, what is it that you learned from that adventure with your mom and dad, but particularly the hotel, because that's the one where you get pretty animated with the kung fu stuff. What do you think you learned from that? Something you think about different, or the moral of the story, or?
Well, I do think after it did occur, at about 4 in the morning then, we opened some wine for my mom to have a little wine, and I called all my brothers and sisters. I didn't even care how early it was in the morning, so I was calling everybody at 4 or 5 in the morning. Most of them drove down to Chicago the next day, and we all kind of had a fun day. So reflecting back on it, I guess I would say that I really learned how important family is. I mean, in that one split second that I saw that guy in that bed with my mom, I thought, wow, I mean, it could be all over for not only her, but for all of us. So that was one thing.
Now, do you notice how her story just changed?
Oh, yeah.
Truly. I mean, it could have been lock the door, sue the hotel, listen to your mother when she says her feet are being covered up and you're not doing it. I mean, it could have been any number of things, but what happened is and I would just keep probing until I felt like it, but also, she got very heartful. That's sort of an external sign to me that she really found that important place in the story. If they're kind of cavalier, like saying, oh, a stitch in time saves 9, it's like, okay, but in your own words, you need to find that place where whatever that matters. The stuff she says is not in the story. about calling her brothers in the after part. So in terms of the lesson learned, we're going to have to make room for that. So even if she was 450 words, we're now going to have to make space decisions around getting that part in. Otherwise, if she jumps from that to the moral of the story, say, excuse me, did you call brothers and sisters, and how many of them do you have? And so you can't like leap us through there.
Okay.
So even if she were at 450, and I doubt that that would be true after I listened to her a bit, it doesn't matter. A part of the story is missing in order to unfold her lesson learned. And now she gets to decide how much setup she needs or not. And in fact, you do need, just inside I judged you, thinking that you wouldn't have to be telling us why you were down there. But because your lesson learned is about how important family is, the fact that you took off time, that you were going to try to make this easier for your mom, that your sister called you in for help is actually a whole part of this story. So it isn't just that there's a story about why you have the hotel, and then this thing, there is bookends to that. So you actually, when I first listened to you, I might have dived in and said, get rid of the first part, just get to the story. When you came to the lesson learned, it gave you something else to really be thinking about. So, what do you think? Okay, so it was very helpful.